Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to be here today. I've enjoyed listening to Celia's presentation, and obviously some of the things that I'm talking about, I believe, also play a role in drug resistance. So that might be something interesting that comes up in our discussion that follows. Um, so just advance here. Sorry, my computer's frozen. Okay, there we go. So what I'd like to just cover over the next 25 minutes or so is just very briefly outline the pathway from discovery to use. And many of you will be very familiar with that, and particularly where the focus of my talk will be on today. And then describe for you the equity effectiveness ladder, and how that plays a role in how medical products or drugs are brought to community and through health systems. And then just outline for you from some of the research that we've done, some of the challenges that we find in both the health system and also at the community or individual level. And then just describe some of the contextual challenges that we need to bear in mind when we talk about bringing a medical product to community. So my aim today is to introduce some of these challenges that we face in the rollout and use of medical products, and also hopefully to illustrate for you as scientists opportunities that could be considered in terms of thinking about the end user during the development stage. So the focus of my talk today is largely going to be on neglected tropical diseases, because that's where the bulk of our research, where my research is focused. And I realized that this is maybe in the way. Okay, I think that's better. So many of you may be familiar with what we call NTDs. There are 20 infectious diseases and conditions that are currently identified by the World Health Organization. They are diseases that affect 1.7 billion people globally. They're ancient diseases, many of them we hear about, for example, in ancient Egypt, or biblical diseases. So they've been around for a long time. And actually, for many of the NTDs, we actually have the tools that are needed to prevent and treat them. They are diseases that are associated with high morbidity and low mortality. Because of their low mortality, because they affect mostly poor and vulnerable people, we find that there's been very little drug development, largely because the return on investment is unlikely. And there are organizations, obviously, like DNDi, who are doing wonderful work in terms of moving forward in this area, but we still see, compared to the burden of disease, just not as much development as is needed. I'll just give a few examples of malaria as well in the talk today, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with malaria, and it remains an important disease, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and where mortality remains high. Whoops. For some reason, there we go. So in terms of the NTDs, I want to focus on what we call the PC NTDs. And these are 5 NTDs that use preventive chemotherapy for elimination. And this is distributed through mass drug administration to all individuals living in endemic communities. And I'll discuss this a little bit more in detail, but the examples that I'll give today on the effectiveness, the equity effectiveness continuum, are based on the PC NTDs. And you can see here images related to lymphatic filariasis in particular, and the elephantiasis and lymphedema of the leg. So here are 3 images of new medical interventions that have or interventions that are used currently, that I want to just highlight some of the challenges that are seen when we actually bring these products to the community. So the first one on the left is the RTSS vaccine that was developed for malaria. Obviously, we were very excited as a community about this, because it presented the first opportunity to have a vaccine for malaria. One of the challenges with the RTSS is that The first 3 doses are connected to the routine immunization schedule, which means it's very easy for mothers or caregivers to bring their children in for their RTSS dose. However, that 4th dose actually falls outside of the routine immunization. And so in early preliminary research in Ghana, Malawi, and Kenya, on the rollout of the RTSS, they found that there was actually a dropout rate associated between that 3rd and 4th dose. And that's important because that 4th dose confers greater protection. In the middle image is praziquantel, which is the drug that's used to treat and used for preventive treatment and treatment of schistosomiasis. These are very big pills. They taste terrible. And they also require individuals to have eaten prior to taking the treatment. What we found, for example, in Madagascar, when we went to understand how communities were actually taking praziquantel, they are undergoing areas, you may be familiar in Madagascar, of drought and famine. And so feeding their children prior to school, where they would be taking the mass drug administration, was not always feasible. And so that did affect actually the uptake of praziquantel in the communities where we were conducting. The final image is my dose. I'm not in front of you, but I'm about 5'7", and that's my dose of IDA, or triple drug therapy for lymphatic filariasis. And I'll talk quite a bit more about this through the talk, but you can see there's 9 pills that I would need to take all at once. In some parts of the world where weight-based dosing is used in order to determine administration of the triple drugs therapy, in the Western Pacific region where body mass index is higher, individuals are being given up to 17 pills in one go. So that's a lot of treatment to take. And when we consider, uptake and concern for people at the community level in taking those treatments, we can imagine that there may be some challenges. So that's really just to kind of get you started and thinking about some of the current public health products or medical products that we're using for NTDs and malaria that we've experienced some challenges in the rollout. So we know that when we have new medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics, we don't go straight from there to the patient, but there's a whole system and structure in place to help to deliver those products through the health system to patients. And I'm not going to spend very much time or any time at all today talking about this part of the access and delivery pathway. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that through your own work. But my talk today is really going to focus more on what happens between the health service and the patient. So just wanted to situate that within that larger pathway. So what happens when a medical product enters into the delivery system? So we're thinking when a product leaves the lab, we know that it is generally efficacious to a certain extent, efficacious enough to be approved and for use in the community. But when we see it actually enter into the system, not everyone has access to that product in the way that it was intended, and I'll describe a little bit more about that. Even when you have access to treatment, not all healthcare providers are actually targeting accurately who should receive that medical product. Then you have the compliance. Does the healthcare provider, actually administer the drug or the test appropriately as it was intended to be used? And then finally, you have the consumer or the patient or the individual. Are they actually taking their treatment as they are intended to take it? And we obviously know a lot about that with regards to AMR. At each of these points in the pathway, we lose some effectiveness, and we also lose some equity. And some of these factors are related to health systems, and some are related to partnership, and some are related at the individual level. So I just want to break down for you some of these based on some of the research that we've done. Just to illustrate this, once again, from the malaria example, you have the efficacy of ACT treatment used for malaria is very efficacious. But as you see, as you go through this pathway, not all patients are able to access clinics with ACT. When they do access those clinics, the diagnostic test is not always performed appropriately. They may not be prescribed appropriately the treatment, and they may not be adhering to the prescription as they should. And so you see, you go from a 98% efficacy to only 37% of malaria patients effectively benefiting from the treatment. This is another example from Tanzania, where you can see at each point along the pathway, from 1,000 simple malaria fevers, only 110 cases, so just above, were actually successfully treated. And each way, at each point along the pathway, we can see that there's a loss to follow up, either because of health care provider access or adherence. So the next examples that I would like to share with you are related to mass drug administration. And I illustrated, this is the vehicle that we use to deliver preventive chemotherapy for for 5 of the neglected tropical diseases. And my particular experience relates most to lymphatic filariasis. And just to illustrate for you what happens, for those of you who may not be familiar, volunteers identified by their communities, community health workers, are trained to deliver the tablets that are safe and free, donated largely by pharmaceutical companies. They bring their tablets to their catchment areas. So usually they're paid for about 5 days worth of work. They need to cover a range of households, sometimes up to 300-400 households over the period of 5 days. They may go house to house, or they may use a distribution post. What's important to note here is that there's no individual diagnosis. If a person is infected, there is a risk of adverse events. And we also have to have high coverage. Over 65% must be reached every year for 4 to 6 years in order to reach elimination of lymphatic filariasis. So I often ask, how would you feel if someone knocked on your door and offered you 10 pills for a disease that perhaps you'd never heard of, never seen, or didn't think you're at risk at? And I think that helps us to understand a little bit some of the challenges that volunteers face when delivering these treatments. So when we remember that equity effectiveness pathway, one of the first considerations is access to treatment. And these are just some of the factors that affect access to treatment that we've seen in our research. We often hear that the distributor never came. We hear incidents where there's a drug stock out. They ran out of one of the pills, one of the tablets that needs to be delivered. MDA, mass drug administration, is often administered at a time that is not appropriate for communities. It may be during harvest time, it may be during school holidays, and so people just simply aren't available. There are also forms of discrimination that we've certainly seen in our research in different parts of the world, where there are communities of IDPs, internally displaced people, migrant workers, who the provincial health system service does not consider as part of their catchment area. Even though a mosquito doesn't determine a difference between where you came from. So each of these and others will affect access to treatment. When we think about targeting accuracy, one of the studies that we did in Indonesia, we actually went and asked healthcare providers who was eligible for treatment. And this would be according to the WHO guidelines. For lymphatic filariasis, individuals need to take all tablets at once when they're administered. And you can see that largely this cohort understood that all tablets needed to be taken. But then when we asked about specific eligibility, what I think is particularly worrying is that only 70% knew that pregnant women were ineligible for taking drugs, the LF treatments. And so there's a clear misunderstanding around eligibility. Furthermore, if people aged over 75 years, there's actually no age cutoff in the WHO guidelines. So this is something that's been introduced either by individual distributors or at the district or community level. So this targeting accuracy can actually reduce the effectiveness of our programs. When we look further at provider compliance, there's variable training of our providers, whether they're distributors or health service, frontline health service personnel. We generally, programs use a cascade training, and that often results in some loss to understanding and follow-up as you go through that training process. Drugs should be directly observed and administered, so they should be taken in front of the person who's bringing them, and that's part of the gold standard WHO guidelines, and we often see that that's not followed through. And this is example from some of our work, again, in Indonesia. And if you look at this first green box, those who received the treatment should also have 100% reported taking it. And what we find is what's called the coverage compliance gap, where individuals who receive the treatment are not taking it in front of the distributor, which means that our coverage numbers then reported coverage is not in line with who's actually taken treatment. And this is a result of health system challenges in that effectiveness ladder. When we think about professionalism, this is from some research that we did in 5 different countries. The professionalism of the distributor is essential, and this may seem obvious to us sitting. But when you're dealing with volunteer distributors who may be only minimally compensated for their work, they don't have a lot of time. They aren't receiving a lot of incentive for their participation. And so they often need to move quickly in order to reach their catchment areas. So when we see these elements of professionalism, we actually see that the community is taking up the treatment as intended. So when we get down to the individual level or patient adherence, we can see that sometimes community members are unaware about the Mass Drug Administration, and I've already highlighted a little bit around the coverage compliance gap and individual groups who don't receive treatment. What I'd like to talk about now is just a little bit around acceptability, which is where we've put quite a bit of our research over the last few years. So we've looked at the following characteristics of acceptability. Some of these seem quite obvious. For example, is the treatment convenient to access? Does it have a perceived benefit for you as an individual? What is the adverse events profile? Do you feel that this is a health problem in your community that's sufficiently severe or important for you actually to react? So these are the different characteristics of acceptability that we've been studying, particularly with regards to Mass Drug Administration for lymphatic filariasis. So we've been engaged in this research at different stages in the process. So prior to the WHO guidelines, development for a new triple drug therapy for lymphatic filariasis in 5 countries. And then we've continued to be involved in countries that are rolling out the regimen for the first time in different sites. So some of the research I'll describe is from that. So in our study in 5 countries on the acceptability of this triple drug therapy, it was important for us to understand what happens at that end stage, at the individual or participant, to see if they would be willing to take this treatment in the future, if they think it's effective and efficacious for them. What we found in our research was that there was actually no difference in acceptability between the standard and new treatment regimen, which was important because in this case, no difference was actually a positive result. So we wouldn't have difficulty introducing the new treatment. You remember my handful of pills, that was a major concern. Was that going to be acceptable for people? And actually we found that if they understood the reason for that handful of pills, that the number of pills wasn't actually a major factor in terms of their agreement and acceptability to take the treatment. I'll just speak a little bit here about what we learned about adverse events. Adverse events are one of the leading causes why people do not take mass drug administration for lymphatic filariasis. And this is one of the first studies where we were actually able to go back to the safety trial data to see who clinically had adverse events. And what we learned in the safety trial was that really only about 12% had a clinical adverse event. But when we look at our study sample and their recall, it's close to a third reported having some form of adverse event. So there's some uh, there's some discordance here, and it's likely because people are feeling differently. There's maybe some social norms here that's going on, but it just reiterates why adverse events are so important to consider, because the clinical versus the recall is very different. We also saw a difference between men and women, and this was also seen in the safety trial. Yeah, I've just highlighted that, so I won't spend any time on that particular slide. I want to end with a few of the contextual factors. So this equity effectiveness ladder does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in a complex context. And these are just some of the factors that we want to bear in mind in our research, and understanding how these factors influence both the health system and the individual. So one of the things that's very important in a mass drug administration program is the ownership of the community. Do they feel like they are part of the administration of the treatment, that the timing is taken into consideration, their needs and their schedules? Are the messages that are being brought to them clearly understood? Are they relevant for them? And we see that this is an element of the programs that is not always well budgeted for. We're also increasingly finding that urban ownership is a lot more challenging, just given the demographics and movements of populations. We know that there are other health priorities that are often more important to communities, particularly when we talk about lymphatic filariasis. As countries move closer to elimination, they don't see cases as frequently, and so it becomes a more difficult, distant disease for them to relate to. This is an image from some work that we did in Haiti, where there are significant other challenges that the country is dealing with and communities are dealing with. And so mass drug administration becomes less important for them to participate in. There are also cultural and social norms that play an important role in the context. Gender within the household. How is information passed? How is it understood? And we see big differences here, again, between urban and rural locations. This, again, plays into how at both the health system and at the patient level, how uptake is transferred and done. And finally, complex situations. We live in a world where movement of peoples is increasing due to economic migration, seasonal migration, insecurity and conflict with internally displaced persons. And so our programs are not always adjusted to deal with influx of individuals into a community. We also live in a climate of misinformation and disinformation, which makes our programs a lot more challenging now to implement. And so increasingly we see the complexity of the context within which we're working. So in conclusion, once the product leaves your lab and enters into this system, there's a lot of challenges that occur, which lower the equity and effectiveness of your product. And it's important I would implore you at the development stage as much as possible to think about the end user. And particularly for those diseases where the return on investment is less, and where the patient profiles and consultations may not be in place in the same way that they may be for a treatment in North America, just to think about that end user and some of these issues as you think about the development. And also, I would encourage you to leverage opportunities to add both acceptability and feasibility research into the development process. There are places along the pathway where questions can be asked in clinical trials to get a sense of how people would use and accept the product that's being developed. So just a thank you to many of our research partners of some of the research that I presented today, and thank you very much.